Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. We are doing our damnedest to get them going again. I trust you're not in too much distress.
June 24th, 1982, and the unfathomable transpires aboard a British Airways Boeing 747. Miles above the Indian Ocean, all 4 engines have catastrophically malfunctioned. Currently, the aircraft is in a state of descent due to absence of power. Before the 261 passengers and personnel, as well as the pilots, perish in the ocean below, they have only a few minutes to restart the engines. An extraordinary narrative of resilience, collaboration, and, most importantly, composure in high-pressure situations ensues. And I have extended an invitation to the commander to recount the narrative. The narrative of British Airways Flight 9 is as follows. On the evening of June 24, 1982, a British Airways Boeing 747 arrived at Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where 3 pilots and 12 flight attendants embarked. The majority of the 248 passengers who had boarded the airplane at London's Heathrow Airport nearly a day prior were eagerly anticipating their arrival. Passengers endured a prolonged voyage. The previous day, Flight 9 had departed from London and made a stopover in Bombay, India, before arriving in Kuala Lumpur. The flight will then proceed to Perth before arriving in Melbourne, where it will commence the final leg of its journey to New Zealand. The personnel who had arrived in Kuala Lumpur a few days prior were in a state of alertness, despite the fact that a significant number of passengers were already fatigued from the lengthy flight. It would be necessary for them to be. They were unaware that they were about to confront the most significant challenge of their careers as they ascended the cockpit of their enormous aircraft. As they engaged in combat against an invisible adversary located thousands of miles above the gloomy ocean, the fate of all aboard would be contingent upon their fortitude and adeptness. For the time being, however, everything was as it should be. The voyage was overseen by Captain Eric Moody. His age of 41 made him one of the youngest 747 commanders in the history of British Airways. In a diverse array of aircraft, he had amassed thousands of hours of flying experience. As fate would have it, he had initiated his professional career as a glider pilot, a skill that would prove to be exceedingly advantageous on this particular evening. Barry Townley Freeman, a 40-year-old engineer, and First Officer Roger Greaves, 32, were present in the cockpit along with him. The aircraft systems were completely understood by the flight engineer, who possessed a wealth of experience. In actuality, he was a flight engineer who was responsible for instructing new flight engineers on how to operate the aircraft systems. Simply put, the occupants could not have been in a more secure situation. At 7:30 p.m. that evening, the massive aircraft was released from the gate at Kuala Lumpur. The passengers prepared for the 5-hour voyage to Perth by settling in. As it transpired, the flight was 30 minutes behind schedule due to its delayed arrival from Bombay. A 30-minute delay on a flight from the United Kingdom to New Zealand would ordinarily be of negligible consequence to the passengers. However, on this particular evening, it would prove to be fatal. Captain Moody brought the aircraft to the airstrip at Kuala Lumpur. During this portion of the voyage, he would be operating the aircraft. The winds were light and the heavens were clear. The weather was ideal for flight. However, the crew was unaware that trouble was brewing deep within the Earth's crust at that precise instant. The Galunggung volcano and the island of Java had commenced their eruptions approximately 1,300 kilometers southeast of Kuala Lumpur. Large quantities of ash and particles were being ejected into the atmosphere, directly into the path of Flight 9. Captain Moody ignited his aircraft's 4 Rolls-Royce engines for departure at 8 o'clock that evening, and the enormous jet thundered down the runway. The aircraft was in the air within seconds and steered southeast towards Perth. Everything proceeded according to plan for approximately the initial 2 hours. The aircraft was elevated to an altitude of 37,000 feet by the commander, where it would remain for the majority of its journey to Australia. In order to acclimatize to the new time zone at their destination, Manny attempted to obtain some sleep while the 248 passengers were served dinner. The pilots were also served dinner, which consisted of a tray of satay, a Malaysian speciality. The pilots conducted the standard en route checks as the aircraft operated efficiently at 37,000 feet. They performed routine radio calls to air traffic control, verified that the autopilot was maintaining the aircraft on course, and compared the fuel they had on board with the quantities specified in the flight plan. Captain Moody once stood up to use the loo. Before embarking on his journey, he verified the weather radar to ensure that there were no impending storms. In fact, the night sky that lay ahead was crystal clear. However, the cockpit was illuminated by an unusual phenomenon within seconds of his departure. The cockpit windscreens were illuminated by St. Elmo's fire, a phenomenon that occurs when electrically charged particles discharge on the windscreen and other front-facing sections of the aircraft, resulting in what appears to be small lightning strikes. It is a phenomenon that is entirely innocuous, and this was not the first instance of its observation by the first officer or flight engineer. However, there was something peculiar about this specific exhibit. Typically, it is only felt when the aircraft is in close proximity to or passing through thunderstorms. Flight 9's pilots were unable to observe any activity on their weather radar. What could be the reason for this display? The crew activated the fasten seatbelt signals and set the engine start switches to continuous ignition as a precaution. The engines would remain operational even if they were to absorb substantial quantities of ice or rain. However, the phenomenon continued to intensify as the seconds passed. It was not long before the crew witnessed the most intense St. Elmo's fire they had ever witnessed. First Officer Greaves and Flight Engineer Townley Freeman requested that a flight attendant retrieve the captain, which was unexpected given the grandeur of the display. Captain Moody was conversing with one of the flight attendants downstairs at that precise moment. He observed an unusual occurrence as he returned to the upper level. The commander was now in a state of alert. In the electronics bay located beneath the cockpit were electrical cables smoldering. And shipboard fire is one of the most catastrophic events that can occur in an aircraft, and it has been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of passengers over the years. Moody would have less than 20 minutes to transport the aircraft to an airport in the event of a conflagration on board. However, upon his return to the cockpit, he was met with the most breathtaking display of St. Elmo's fire he had ever witnessed, rather than 2 anxious colleagues hastily conducting fire exercises. The 3 men were captivated by the spectacle before them, as lightning bolts of varying sizes, shapes, and colors flashed up and down their windscreens. The captain ascended to his seat, secured his seatbelt, and examined his weather radar. St. Elmo's fire was exclusively observed during thunderstorms or a high, thin layer of cloud known as cirrus, according to his observations. But he was unable to observe any storms after tilting the radar device up and down to scan for them. This was genuinely perplexing. It appeared as though he had encountered St. Elmo's fire in a clear environment. He returned to his side window to observe the engines, and to his surprise, they were experiencing the same phenomenon. They emanated a blue radiance, as if they were illuminated from within. Additionally, the leading edge of the wing was illuminated in a manner reminiscent of a white-hot knife. First Officer Greaves glanced out his window and observed the same event on his side. However, the performance was not yet concluded. In reality, it was only beginning to take shape. The St. Elmo's fire on the windscreen was replaced by an even more scintillating display within seconds. It appeared as though thousands of miniature blue tracer bullets were being discharged at the windscreen. It appeared as though the aircraft was approaching warp speed, on the brink of entering an additional dimension. The pilots were taken aback. What could possibly be occurring? There was no other indication that anything was unusual. There were no unusual sounds, vibrations, or shaking. Engine number 4, the outboard engine located on the right side, abruptly failed at 20:09 that evening, despite the fact that the event was wholly tranquil. Captain Moody promptly requested the engine shutdown protocol, and the flight crew initiated the engine shutdown process. This entailed the following: repositioning the thrust lever to idle, activating the cutoff feature on the start lever, which disconnected the gasoline supply, and activating the fire handle in the event of an engine fire. Although engine failures were not exceedingly frequent, they were far from alarming on a 4-engine aircraft such as the 747. The aircraft was entirely capable of operating with 3 motors. However, the pilots had only just completed the checklist when, without any prior notification, engines 2 and 3 malfunctioned, followed promptly by engine 1. The pilots were astounded by the news. All 4 engines had malfunctioned. With a capacity of 263 passengers and personnel, their enormous jet had now evolved into the world's largest glider. And now, with each passing minute, it was inching closer to the ocean below. Within a matter of seconds, their extraordinary circumstance had transitioned from awe-inspiring to either life or death. The fate of all aboard now hinged on the pilot's ability to salvage their disabled aircraft before it plummeted into the Indian Ocean. It is almost unheard of for all engines to malfunction simultaneously on a passenger aircraft. Almost invariably, this occurs as a result of the pilot's negligence. In light of this, the captain conducted an inspection of the fuel pumps. The engines would have been compelled to drop the fuel pumps if he and his personnel had inadvertently set them to do so. Fuel from a single tank, which subsequently ran out. However, upon conducting an inspection, it was discovered that the fuel injectors were drawing from each tank. So, what about the electrical system? Moody also examined the circuit breakers, but no problems were identified. Alternatively, was it frosting? It was conceivable that the engines had become obstructed by ice at their altitude. However, it did not appear to be the engine anti-ice system that was activated. The 3 crew members were certain that they had made a mistake. However, they were compelled to push this belief to the back of their minds. They were now in a life-or-death situation as they plummeted towards the Indian Ocean, and their sole objective was to reignite the aircraft's engines. They would plunge into the water below in a matter of minutes if they were unable to accomplish this. The first officer was instructed by the captain to declare a mayday to air traffic control, while the flight engineer and he were conducting the checklist to reactivate the engines. The commander initiated the process of reorienting the aircraft towards Jakarta as they did so. The plane was at risk of stalling and plummeting from the atmosphere due to the possibility of the engines losing thrust at their elevated altitude. The commander maintained the aircraft's speed by pitching the nose down to prevent this. It was necessary to achieve a delicate equilibrium in this situation. The captain was required to exchange potential energy, which was represented by the aircraft's height, for kinetic energy, which was represented by its speed, in physics terms. However, even the most precise flying in the world would not prevent the unavoidable if the other pilots were unable to resume the engines. In the absence of propulsion, the plane would experience a 1-kilometer loss in altitude for every 15 kilometers it traveled. The pilots were able to travel approximately 165 kilometers from an altitude of 37,000 feet. The right side was sufficient to enable the glide to the nearest airport, Jakarta. Or it would have been, but for one critical factor: a towering mountain range, measuring 3.5 kilometers in height, stood between the aircraft and Jakarta. The aircraft would be unable to traverse the mountains from its present location. This implied that the pilots would be compelled to perform the unthinkable if they were unable to initiate the engines. They would be compelled to reverse course and abandon their completely loaded 747 on the ocean at night. They were aware that this would result in the near certainty of mortality for all individuals on board. They were experiencing an immense amount of stress. However, they were unaware that the most dreadful part was yet to come. The initial officer was unable to communicate with air traffic control via the radio for an unknown reason. He made numerous attempts, but the controller appeared to be incapable of comprehending his message. The first officer informed the controller that all 4 engines had failed, despite the fact that the controller seemingly believed the rightmost engine, the number 4 engine, had failed. Firstly, the controller's level of disbelief was palpable. It is not uncommon for all 4 engines to malfunction on a contemporary passenger aircraft. However, this was not the sole issue. Flight 9 had flown directly into an ash cloud generated by the Mount Galunggung volcano on the island of Java, which was unknown to the crew or any other individual. Static electricity discharged from the dried ash as the plane flew through it at nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour, resulting in the light display that the pilots observed on their windscreens. Quite astonishingly, this had resulted in the formation of an electronic cocoon that encased the aircraft, obscuring the anti-radio signals that the pilots transmit or receive. This rendered it exceedingly challenging for the controller to comprehend the pilot's communication. However, the Singapore Airlines Boeing 747, which was traveling the same route, miraculously appeared a few dozen miles behind Flight 9. The first officer's messages were transmitted to Jakarta Air Traffic Control by the pilots of that flight, who were able to hear them more distinctly. Individuals on the ground finally comprehended the severity of the crew's circumstances. The pilots of the Singapore Airlines flight reversed course in order to avoid being entangled in a similar situation. The pilots of British Airways Flight 9 were entirely autonomous in the cockpit. As if their circumstances were not already peculiar enough, the activities of their aircraft were inconsistent with the simulations they had conducted. For instance, the cockpit's lights were illuminated despite the nearly complete absence of electrical power. Furthermore, systems were operational when they were not intended to be, while others were not. Surprisingly, the automation was one of the systems that was operational. This was of immense assistance to the pilots. The captain was able to assist his companions with the engine relights once the autopilot was activated. The passengers were gripped by fear in the passenger cabin. As the plane descended towards the ocean below, the engine's soothing hum was displaced by an eerie silence. Wisps of acrid electrical smoke began to enter the cabin, causing some passengers to wheeze and stinging their eyes. The pilots were not at all concerned about the smoke, which, under normal circumstances, would have been a cause for extreme concern, despite the fact that the passengers in the first-class cabin directly behind the pilots were mostly unconscious. They faced a threat that was significantly more imminent. The engines were unable to reignite despite their numerous attempts. The altimeter was unwinding second by second. Similar to a timepiece, the moment it reached 0, the time was up. The pilots were unable to add any time to this counter. However, They were able to make as many engine restart attempts as possible within the time they had remaining. Nevertheless, the procedure for restarting the engines was lengthy and complex. They would only have a limited number of opportunities to restart the engines before they were able to reach the water if they followed each step. The inventory was condensed to include only the most critical items, and the pilots reviewed it repeatedly as the altimeter approached zero. The roof was thrown off by the adrenaline that was flowing in the cramped cockpit. However, an unwelcome warning arrived in the midst of their tenacious endeavors. The aircraft was in the process of depressurizing. The cabin was experiencing an air leakage as a result of the absence of turbines to pump air into it. At their present altitude of 26,000 feet, there was insufficient oxygen to support life. The pilots promptly proceeded to retrieve their oxygen masks. However, First Officer Greaves' oxygen mask ruptured in his palms as he attempted to apply it. The other two crew members had successfully donned theirs and were able to communicate with one another via the built-in microphones. However, the first officer, who was essential to the crew's engine resume endeavors, was unfortunately no longer informed. Additionally, he would rapidly lose consciousness due to the insufficient oxygen in the diminishing atmosphere. Captain Moody was confronted with an exceptionally difficult decision. In order to save his comrade, should he dive his aircraft to a lower altitude? Alternatively, should he maintain his valuable altitude in order to have the opportunity to reignite the engines multiple times? The captain and flight engineer deliberated on their alternatives and ultimately reached a conclusion. Therefore, the decision was made. The commander intended to execute an uncertain transaction. He intended to exchange valued altitude for the use of his first officer. Pulling the speed brake handle, he lowered the aircraft's snout. The plane's descent caused the occupants' stomachs to ascend into their mouths. The speed brakes disrupted the smoothly flowing air over the wings, causing the entire aircraft to vibrate and shake. This was a dramatic maneuver that was being executed in order to reintegrate the first officer into the cockpit crew. The landing gear was to be extended by the pilots as part of the procedure for this rapid descent. However, Moody once more resolved to eliminate the inventory. He was aware that the aircraft would be torn apart if he were to land it in the ocean, as the extended landing gear would cause it to sink into the water. Within a mere minute, the aircraft had been airborne for an impressive 6,000 feet. Captain Moody stole the speed brakes and slowed the plane's descent at 20,000 feet. The first officer miraculously reassembled his oxygen mask during the dive, despite the impending hypoxia and immense pressure. The three males were now reunited as a team. However, their endeavors to reignite the engines were now heightened by the fact that they were at a significantly lower altitude of 20,000 feet. However, as if this were not already a severe enough situation, the captain now observed an additional complication. The first officer reported that the aircraft was flying at 320 knots, while his airspeed indicator indicated that it was flying at 270 knots. This distinction was of paramount importance. The plane would not restart its engines unless it was flying at a speed between 250 knots and 270 knots, which is outside of this limited window. Consequently, the commander was once more confronted with a difficult decision. In which instrument should he place his trust? The engines may not resume if he made the incorrect decision. His decision was to hedge his wagers rather than make a wild guess as to which was the most accurate. He would be able to adjust the aircraft's speed by adjusting the pitch of the aircraft, spending a portion of the time in the correct speed window according to his instruments, and a portion of the time in the correct speed window according to the first officer's instruments. He was optimistic that his colleagues would eventually be able to start the engines as he was traveling through the appropriate speed zone. But the passengers were treated to a horrifying spectacle as the pilots attempted to restart the engines. The engines emitted brilliant flame appendages. As hot flames raced by outside, the cabin's interior was illuminated in shades of red and orange. It was reminiscent of a nightmare. The plane was not only en route to the ocean, but its engines were also on fire, and the interior was filled with smoke. Some passengers screamed while others began to compose letters to their loved ones in the hopes that they would be found after the aircraft had crashed. The pilots were not cognizant of the fire. However, it would not have been a significant concern to them had they been. Of course, fuel was required to be introduced into the engines and ignited as part of the restarting process. Typically, this ignition would occur within the turbine. However, the engine's failure resulted in the fuel spewing back from them and being ignited outside the engine, resulting in the formation of enormous jets of flame. The commander at this juncture resolved to address the passengers in an effort to alleviate their anxiety. His remarks would be remembered as one of the most exceptional instances of understatement in the annals of aviation. Additionally, he requested that the principal flight attendant accompany him to the cockpit at the conclusion of this message. In British Airways, this was a code that instructed the flight attendants to prepare the compartment for a crash landing or a ditching in the water. The chief flight attendant hastened to the cockpit, where Captain Moody provided him with instructions on how to prepare the cabin for a ditching in the ocean. However, the flight attendant was unable to comprehend Moody's speech due to the oxygen mask. He determined that it would be more prudent to allow the pilots to complete the task and return to the cabin preparations, rather than request that he reiterate himself at an inopportune moment. The pilots have attempted to reignite the engines on numerous occasions, but they have yet to detect any signs of life. They were compelled to make a difficult decision. A colossal mountain range was visible in the darkness that lay ahead of them. The airport was situated on the opposite shore. They would be unable to traverse the highlands in the absence of engines. Consequently, Captain Moody issued an ultimatum to the personnel. They would turn around and abandon the aircraft in the ocean if the engines were unable to be reignited by the time the plane reached 12,000 feet. It would be nearly impossible for the pilots to make a ditching survivable at night, as they would have no means of observing the ocean as it approached. The abyss is indeed situated beneath them. Nevertheless, the pilots persevered in their relentless pursuit to reignite the engines despite the apparent hopelessness of the situation. Despite the fact that the checklist prohibited it, the commander elected to attempt to restart engine number 4. They had armed the fire handle in anticipation of an engine fire when they initially turned it down. Following this, it is prohibited to attempt to reignite the engine. However, in their circumstances, the engine's resumption was the most important procedure. Ultimately, there was a 25% likelihood that engine number 4 would be the only one to be restarted if they were only able to reignite one of their engines. The aircraft was now approaching 12,000 feet, the altitude at which the pilots had determined that they would turn around and ditch if the engines were not reignited. At that moment, engine number 4 suddenly resurged after numerous unsuccessful attempts. The pilots were ecstatic. Captain Moody increased the engine's thrust to its utmost capacity, which allowed him to extend the plane's glide. However, a single engine would not be sufficient to traverse the mountain range. A minimum of 1 additional aviator was required. The crew continued their efforts on the other 3 engines as the seconds passed by, buoyed by their success with engine number 4. After 30 heart-pounding seconds, engine 3 was restored to operation. There was now a genuine opportunity for the personnel. The pilots were propelled into their seats as the other 2 engines reignited approximately 1 minute later. In the words of the first officer, the crew was now back in business. The captain informed the passengers after the first officer radioed air traffic control to notify them that they had successfully restarted all 4 engines. Disaster had been averted mere minutes before it was poised to strike the ocean. However, their ordeal was not yet complete. The crew was still unaware of the events that had transpired. They were unaware of the reasons for the engine's failure and their subsequent resumption. At any moment, they were terrified that the engines would malfunction once more. Therefore, their primary objective was to establish a buffer zone between themselves and the sea below. Captain Moody initiated a climb after Jakarta Control approved the flight to 15,000 feet. The St. Elmo's fire re-emerged as the aircraft ascended to 15,000 feet. This time, the pilots were not willing to take any chances. The captain immediately initiated his descent. Engine 2, the interior engine on the left-hand side, began to shake violently as he descended. The engine was turned down by the captain due to the intensity of the vibration. Flight 9's crew was now resigned to limping back to Jakarta, clinging to 3 fragile engines. However, they were met with 2 unpleasant discoveries. We should designate this subsequent phase as the most difficult aspect of the entire ordeal, as the captain would later attest. The pilots flew over Jakarta at an altitude of 10,000 feet while the sky was still pitch dark. In order to prevent the engines from failing again, they resolved to maintain the propulsion levers at their current position until the plane was moments away from touchdown. In an effort to regulate his velocity, the captain deployed the speed brakes and the flaps. He was employing aerodynamic drag to counteract the propulsion generated by the engines. However, air traffic control delivered some unfavorable news to the crew as they flew over the city and prepared for their arrival. The glide slope at the aerodrome was malfunctioning. The glide slope is one of the 2 components of the instrument landing system, the other being the localizer. It provides the personnel with precise vertical guidance as they descend to the runway. The pilot's workload was about to increase significantly without it. The first officer would be required to rapidly construct a virtual glide slope, indicating to the commander the appropriate height at various distances from the runway. Typically, this would not have been a significant issue, as the runway was visible from a considerable distance and the night was crystal clear. However, as they assembled on the airstrip, they were met with an additional surprise. They were preceded by the city lights of Jakarta. However, the area where the airport is typically located was a mere black expanse. The pilots were familiar with the location of the runway in relation to the city, as they had flown into Jakarta on numerous occasions. However, it appeared that there was nothing there for some unknown cause. The initial officer contacted the tower and requested that the runway lights be activated. Indeed, the airport appeared in the exact location they had anticipated just a few seconds later. However, there was still something peculiar. It appeared as though the entire city was enveloped in a thick fog. The weather forecast indicated that the sky would be crystal clear. What could be the reason for this? The windscreen wipers were attempted by the pilots. However, they were unsuccessful. The windscreens were subsequently wiped down by the individuals themselves to prevent the formation of condensation. However, the window's view was still hazy. They were unable to discern any level of detail. They only observed smudges of light. The commander then observed that a thin line of clarity protruded from the left side of his windscreen. He could see the runway clearly through it. This was exceedingly peculiar. However, he was determined to determine its origin without delay. He had to land as quickly as possible to prevent any further complications with his aircraft. To ensure that he had an unobstructed view of the runway, he scooted over in his seat and leaned against the left window post. The first officer guided the captain in, providing altitudes and speeds, while the captain leaning against the window post made minor adjustments to pitch and power. It was a delicate operation. The commander then brought the engines to a standstill as he crossed the runway threshold. The initial officer decelerated the aircraft's altitude. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, touchdown. The captain decelerated the brakes and permitted the nose wheel to descend onto the runway. The passengers erupted in acclaim. They had recently endured one of the most harrowing ordeals ever to occur on a passenger aircraft. The pilots were also greatly relieved. However, they continued to be bewildered. What could possibly have caused this peculiar quadruple engine failure? The aviation industry was significantly impacted by this volcanic debris encounter. The VAACs, or Volcanic Ash Advisory Centers, were the most significant outcome. Currently, 9 of these centers have been established, encompassing the entire global airspace. Their sole objective is to monitor volcanic activity and issue warnings to aviation authorities when volcanic ash clouds pose a hazard to air travel. The efficacy of these centers in preventing the recurrence of similar incidents is evident when one considers the 2010 Icelandic volcano eruption, which resulted in the closure of the majority of Europe's airspace. I will conclude my reflections on this incident by granting Captain Moody the final say. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.